We're going to begin this panel talking a little bit about Amiri Baraka, but we're also, I want to hear, we have some amazing musicians and poets on stage here. And so we're going to get into their personal stories as well. To my immediate right, we have Oliver Lake, musician, composer. We have Fred Moten, who's coming in from California. He's a professor at the University of California, Riverside. We have Jason Hwang, musician and composer, and of course, William Parker, who everyone here knows for sure. I was wondering, Fred, if we could begin with you. I know you did your dissertation on Amiri Baraka. You studied his work for a long time. Amiri was very involved in the Vision Festival for the first 18 years of this festival. This is the first time he's not been here. Your thoughts today, and if you could talk about his importance.
Well, I mean, first of all, thanks. Very glad to be here with all of you. It's an honor to be sitting next to these folks. So let me see, a couple things. First of all, I just, we miss him. It was not a loss that we can afford right now. And so it leaves a bunch of people with a lot of work to do. He's not replaceable by one person, and I don't even think he's replaceable by 50 people. But we got to work and try to figure out ways to be both, to advocate for the music in the way that he did, to advocate for art, to advocate for social development, and to advocate for an alternative, another way to live than the one that we're held within right now. But we have his example, and his example is prodigious in terms of. I was a student of literature. I think Baraka's writing is the first literature that I actually recognized as literature. Going back to when I was probably 11 or 12 years old, my mom had this anthology called Black Voices, and it had some poetry, mostly early poetry by Baraka, by Leroy Jones at that time, preface to a 20-volume suicide note. That was the first poem I ever read that I actually recognized as a poem. Like, I recognized that particular use of language was special and different, and that was 40 years ago. And for me, he's still the touchstone, not just for the Afro-American or Afro-diasporic literary tradition, but that's, like I said, for me, Baraka was literature. That's what I recognized first and foremost as literature. And at the end of the day, what I began with is, I'm sure, what I'll end with as far as his work is concerned. So for me, it's a great personal significance, but I think it's also a significance that's broader than just me, because he's one of the towering figures of 20th century literature in the world. So.
And William, I was wondering if you could talk about the work you've done with Amiri, and it's also just his role in this community and his support of this community, and his artistic legacy.
Well, Amiri was a inexhaustible worker. He would just work all the time on his writing. He's very prolific, and he'd write all the time, and it would make sense, and it would be strong. It would be the writing had equaled the message in what he was doing. Whenever you called on him to come to a rally or to join in on something, he would be there. When we had something called the Bronx Poetry Theater up in Prospect Avenue, Luis Reyes Rivera's George Edward Tate, and then we had the Third World Cultural Center on 167th Street between 3rd Avenue up in the Bronx, run by Ben Caldwell. And he would come up there and from Newark, and he would lend his voice to those things. When the tenor saxophone player Herbie Morgan had his stroke, and we went out to Herbie's house to play for Herbie, and it was very short because Baraka said, well, I've got to go to Virginia tonight to do another thing, and then tomorrow I've got to be in California, and then the next day he might be in Europe, and the next day. So he was always working. When we did do concerts in Europe, you know, a lot of musicians would arrive the day before the concert to take a rest and be vital for the next day. He would usually arrive the day of the concert and be ready to hit. He was a real road warrior, but he was also very brilliant. You know, very, very, very smart person, very brilliant. And he had a way of analyzing situations and coming up with the response that was always another viewpoint that wasn't looked at. You know, if any of you saw him on the Bill O'Reilly show, he ate Bill O'Reilly up, which very few people could do. You know, and in fact, I think Bill O'Reilly was scared of him. You know, the truth was popping out of there so much. I have a videotape of it at home, and so his immediate work with me, I worked with him with, you know, lots of different people, you know, Rashid Ali, and but when I was doing this project in 2000 called the music, what was it called? Curtis Mayfield Project. And the idea was to, you know, Curtis Mayfield was very political in his songs and his lyrics, but he had died already. So the idea was to do modern arrangements of Curtis Mayfield's music plus originals, but I needed a voice who would extend the content or sentiment of Curtis Mayfield. And so I called up Amiri, and he said, yeah. And he came to the rehearsal with no material. He came to the rehearsal with a blank book because he didn't know. I didn't tell him anything. He didn't know what we were going to do. And then he, you know, we did People Get Ready. Then he began to write and respond to People Get Ready. And then we did People Who Are Darker Than Blue. So each song he would write and compose right there on the spot, and it worked immediately. So, and that's just me. He worked with a lot of people. He worked with, he worked with Henry Threadgill in Air. He worked with David Murray. You know, you can look down the resume. But he was very what you know, Jane Cortez say, Spitfire. Yeah, he's very, 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 very. He would ignite things and begin things, and he was not afraid to hold his ground, because we recorded what's the name? Someone Blew Up America, and I was ready to put it out, but the record producer did not want to put it out. You know, so he said, well, could you please ask Amiri to see if he can take that line out about the Jews. That was very controversial. And I said, I'm not asking him to take that line out, you know, but the producer asked him, and he said no. You know, so we didn't put it out on that particular label, you know. So he was not afraid of anybody. And but he also, this is the last thing I'm going to say, he also began to reflect at the end. And he told me, he said, you know, I guess a couple of days before Martin Luther King was assassinated, Martin Luther King came to his house. And he here was some conflict between him and King, but he said, I understand what he was talking about now, and that I apologize. And he also mentioned Sidney Poitier, and some other people who he had been very sort of not agreeing with them on things, but he began to take a more universal, rounded view of things. So he was constantly growing and learning from all his experiences.
And Oliver, could you add into this discussion? I know you brought something you'd like to read related to this.
Right. Experiences I had with Amiri Baraka go back before the times that I met him by reading his book, Blues People, in St. Louis when I was young, and then moving to New York in 1974 and meeting him in person, and us forming a relationship that lasted up until he passed, and the relationship goes on because we're here now. And we worked together several times. The last liner notes of the Trio 3 CD, Baraka wrote the liner notes for that. That'll be coming out later this fall. I think those were the last liner notes that he wrote because it was about 2 weeks prior to his passing. And Baraka was also a talented artist, visual artist. I had presented him one time at my home with his art and his poetry. And throughout the years, it seems like he's come to all of my concerts. I don't know how. He was a prolific in terms of attending and being a part of this music. I wrote a piece for him. You look marvelous. Who are you wearing? I'm wearing Amiri Baraka, ultimate soul brother. He was always there for you. You look marvelous. Who are you wearing? I'm wearing Blues People and the Dutchman. Always flat at the 3rd and the 7th with the Blues People. In the scale of things, he was always making you laugh. He was always. You look marvelous. Who are you wearing? I'm wearing Baraka. It's stunning, serious, gorgeous, straightforward and to the point. Clean lines, poet laureate-like. You look marvelous. Who are you wearing? I'm wearing Amiri, who always stood his ground. Even though small in stature, he was a giant, spreading his words. He was always. You look marvelous. Who are you wearing? Revolutionary word poems by the Black Arts Movement and doing the jitterbug. Amiri, the smooth operator, every day, very smart, very funny, very kind.
Now, Oliver, that poem, you mentioned the Black Arts Movement, and I was wondering if you could expand on the impact that movement had on you, and also the impact it had on the formation of the Black Artist Group in St. Louis.
Well, at the time the Black Artist Group formed, that was in the late 60s, that was a period that was called Black Power, but it was also had to do with self-determination and determining our own destiny. And the artists in St. Louis, artists in Chicago, artists on the West Coast, artists in New York formed these organizations that were about being in charge of their destiny, and the Black Artist Group was one of those groups. We started in 1968, and we were influenced not only by Baraka, but also the AACM, who had started before we had. And when I moved to New York, I continued to proceed with the lessons that I learned in the Black Artist Group in terms of self-promotion and in terms of being in charge of my destiny and making things happen. And that was one of the main things that I got out of that movement, to be in charge of what we do as artists.
And Jason, I want to bring you into this conversation to talk about another group that you were involved in, the Basement Workshop. If you could describe what it was and the impact it had on you growing up as a musician.
Well, I remember when I came to New York to go to school, I ventured down St. Mark's Place, and there was this haircutting place. Oh, no, it was a bookstore, East Side bookstore. And I saw a flyer that said Basement Workshop, Asian American Multicultural Organization. And that was the first time I saw those two words put together, Asian American. And I thought, well, that's me, you know. So I went there, and I met other Asian Americans. The first time I met other Asians who were born in America, where English was their first language. And that togetherness there was very parallel to what Oliver described, because it was about the empowerment through the refusal to be marginalized, the affirmation of history, the rejection of stereotypes. Because you think of that time as America was post-war with several Asian nations from, Japan, Korea, Vietnam, and so they were very. It was that type of atmosphere. It wasn't until '66 that the restrictive immigration policies towards Asians had been lifted. So it's fairly recent history. But, at that time, there were no albums for me to listen to by Asian Americans, no novels or movies, newscasters. As recent as a couple of years ago, I was listening to T.W. Chang give a talk, and he said between the Boston and the Washington market, there was only one other Asian American male on network television, and he got fired, actually. But there were a preponderance of Asian American women. So, when we talk about a post-racialized society, it's still, the world is still organized by race. There's still those issues of perception that have to be addressed. So when I listen to Baraka read, the thing that makes an impact on me when I've seen him perform and on your video is his words of truth, his mind and spirit and intellect and voice were aligned. So he's a resonant person to me. His vibrations are that powerful because he understood, like we musicians understand, that music or poetry, it's a ritual of truth, seeking to become that truth. So we're always on that quest to find that deeper part of ourselves to share with others.
And William, I also want to ask you about the issue of self-determination, and if you could talk a little bit about some of the organizing you did within the musical community, dating back to the early 1970s. I was doing a little research for this, and I read about a festival that you organized with Billy Bang. Was it 1972 or 1973? And just the organizing you did then, and how that grew into the Vision Festival that we all celebrate now.
It's a natural thing. Okay, if you corner somebody and you put someone in solitary confinement, they're going to want air, they're going to want water, they're going to want food, they're going to want light. And the reason for any kind of self-determination movement was that the establishment was not doing justice to the music that had been created, to the poetry and writings that were being written by the writers. They had to put out their own magazine. They put out, there's a magazine called The Cricket, which was put out by Baraka and Larry Neal on the East Coast, and actually on the West Coast, you had contributors. Actually, Stanley Crouch was a contributor, and but the main contributors to that magazine were musicians. I have every issue of The Cricket at home. You had Milford Graves writing, Sun Ra's poetry and writing. You had many other musicians reviewing each other's records. simply because there was no voice. So they had to be the voice for themselves. So in the 70s, we were sitting around and there's no gigs. We're not being hired at the Newport Festival, so we create our own festival. On whatever level that it can be created, it was, whether it's, you find a place, the place we found was someplace nice. John Dahl, who was a very strong activist at the time, and he offered us the place. We got the musicians, Jalalu Calvert Nelson, Clyde Cotton, Henry P. Warner, whoever we could get that would be willing to play, we got, and like anybody else, we put flyers up, we advertised, and we hoped that people would come. And people came, and we were playing there. Actually, we were playing there one day with a group was called the Music Ensemble, and Joe Bowie and Luther Petty and Luther Thomas had just come in from St. Louis, and they heard the music, and they came in, and we met them. And so this is how things happen. People were coming to New York, but we had to keep doing things ourselves until other things kicked in. And to this day, nothing's really kicked in.
Say I met William at Basement Workshop, and so the music was crossing over into all sorts of communities.
And Fred, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your book, in the break. I know in the book you talk about Coltrane, you talk about Albert Ayler, and you put them in in kind of like the Black radical tradition as part of the subtitle of it. I haven't had a chance to read the book yet, but if you could talk a little bit about the thesis and just how that book fits into what we're talking about here.
Well, so there's a great political scientist named Cedric Robinson who teaches in California at University of California, Santa Barbara. And he wrote a book, it was published in '82, I think, called Black Marxism, The Making of the Black Radical Tradition. And in that book, he talks primarily about W.B. Du Bois, C.L.R. James, and Richard Wright. And I would say that, there are many other figures who contribute to and are key figures of that tradition. And certainly Baraka is one. Not only because of the way in which, he both takes up kind of Marxist theory, but then also revises it and extends it in ways that enrich and deepen it. But also because he understands and always understood the intensity of the relationship between, sort of political insurgency and cultural insurgency. And in a lot of ways, to talk about, my book is trying to talk about the aesthetics of the Black radical tradition, and he's the central figure in my book. The book kind of revolves around an essay that Baraka wrote that was published in a book called Black Music in, I think it's 1968, and the essay is called The Burton Green Affair. And he's sort of talking about this concert where Burton Green was playing with, with Pharoah Sanders and a couple other musicians, and he's really interested in trying to figure out why it is that there's something about Burton Green's playing that's just incompatible with those other musicians. And at that moment, kind of in the height of, the Black arts movement and a real intense kind of Black nationalism, the answer that emerges, and it's not an easy answer, but some folks might think it is that, that the reason that Burton Green can't play or is not playing the reason his playing isn't doing what those other musicians are doing is because he's white. But I think it's a much deeper, and I think Baraka, all throughout the course of his life and subsequent writing was always working to understand that this gap, this distance was a function of a whole bunch of, much deeper things. And it really, I guess all I'm trying to do really is just to try to, I remember when when Miles Davis died, and Baraka wrote this kind of great elegy for Miles Davis that was published in the Village Voice. And at one point he says in the text that, he says, we all your children, Miles, right? And I just feel like that's the same formulation could be made for Baraka. So really, I'm just trying to like follow in the footsteps of somebody who, for me, was like a kind of spiritual and intellectual father who understood that the Black radical tradition is not just for people who are called Black. The Black radical tradition has cultural and spiritual and aesthetic and social resources, which if it were actually paid attention to, and if it were actually deeply considered and thought and felt, it might actually contribute to the saving of the earth, which right now is in grave danger.
Oliver, I was wondering if you could talk about your move to New York, your connection to the loft scene, and also your formation of your own record label, Passing Through, and why you felt you needed to put out your own records and not rely on others to do so.
But before I do that, I wanted to just relate a short story. After Baraka passed, my wife called his wife, Amina, and Amina was telling her, she said, I've been with Baraka all of these years, and I didn't know he was this big because of the people that came to the funeral and the way the city of Newark treated him with such respect in his passing, and the magnitude of that funeral and the people that were there. And she said she was in awe. She said, I knew he was big, but I didn't know he was that big. But in terms of me starting my own label, it goes back to self-determination, and we never know where this music is going to end up. So I felt if I owned my music, I would reap whatever benefits that happen. I can remember once hearing a Cherokee car commercial and hearing John Coltrane's music on television. And I said, when Coltrane recorded that, he had no idea it was going to be used in a commercial for a car advertisement. And it made me think, if you own your music, the copyright, and the recording, and all of the rights to it, then whenever something happens, you can reap the benefit from that. So I started my own label called Passing Through. And that's what all of us are doing, passing through. And that's what Baraka just did. He passed through, but he passed through very strongly.
And William, you've also started your own label, Centering Records, that you've been doing now for, I guess, a couple decades. And of course, Amiri had his own label for a brief period, Jihad Records. If you could just talk about the need for artists to control their own work.
Well, first of all, if you're putting out your own music, then you can put what you want on the record. You can put what you want on the cover. You can say what you need to say about your music in whatever writing or notes you're putting in. So you have complete control over it. You own the music, as Oliver just said, and it's true, very true. You never know what's going to happen down the line if someone uses your music for something. So it's a good. I mean, you don't like to do all of the business, the calculating and the record keeping, but you can get someone else to do that for you. If one was going to do that. But you had in the '60s, Milford Graves and Don Pullen had the Self-Reliance music, and they put out LPs. Sun Ra would press his own LPs. I mean, it was a common thing. Charles Mingus did it with Candid in the 50s, with early 60s with Max Roach, and it was a common practice to do your own thing and own your own land. The old school of never buy anything on credit. I mean, my parents and a lot of parents, they save money and they pay cash for things. They do not want to owe anybody. You know, Mom said, you don't own anything. I mean, she said, you don't borrow and you don't lend. I mean, I don't borrow, but I do lend. But, you know, it's an old school way of doing things. You know, you have to rise up and do things. And it's very important to do that with your own work, and also to do that in your form of lending your voice when something's wrong, you know, and not just sit down and accept things, but not just offer your opinion about it, but actually say that, you know, you have power. It's supposed to be a democracy, but we don't really utilize the concept of, because it's not in the way things are set up, where right now, if they raise the toll on the bridge, people say, you know, they interview people and they say, oh, they raised the bridge, the toll for, you know, $5, and people they say, oh, well, okay, I guess I gotta pay it, you know, but you never know where that money goes, you know. So, and that's with a lot of things, programs, and because we don't question, we sort of lay back. And it's very important to get in the habit of protesting, of not just accepting things, because you know, there are really like tons and tons of lies out here that people just accept and they don't really put to test.
He was always I got a chance to spend, you know, decent amount of time with him on a couple of different occasions. He was always so just nice, you know, so cool, you know, and usually I have people who are like heroes of mine, and sometimes you meet your heroes and it's kind of disappointing, you know, because the greatness of the work that you love isn't sort of matched by the greatness or the graciousness of the person. But that was, I mean, he opened up his home, you know, I mean, all these things. But you know how sometimes you get in this very strange position of feeling like you kind of want to have a disagreement with your hero, you know? Like, it's really weird to disagree with the person who made it possible for you to think whatever it is you're thinking anyway, you know? But the one time where I felt like maybe I kind of had a disagreement with Baraka was about, you know, President Obama, who he, you know, for much of Obama's term, he, you know, was a real strong supporter, and the way the strength of his support was manifest was in the sort of brutality with which he attacked people who were criticizing Obama. Like, he wrote this like 25-page thing on the internet, man. I was just like, I'd rather get talked bad about I'd rather get talked about by anybody else in the world but him, you know. But he wrote this. But when the United States bombed Libya, he wrote a poem called "The New Invasion of Africa," and it was published on March 21st, 2011. And I don't think he was necessarily taking back his support of Obama, but he was also registering his disappointment at Obama's policy. And so he says, so it would be this way, that they would get a Negro to bomb his own home, to join with the actual colonial powers, Britain, France, add poison Hillary with Israeli and Saudi to make certain that revolution in Africa must have a stopper. So call in the white people who long tasted our blood. They would be the copper. Overthrow Libya with some bullshit humanitarian scam with the Negro yapping to make it seem right, far right. But that's how Africa got enslaved by the white, a Negro selling his own folk, delivering us to slavery in the middle of the night. When will you learn, poet, and remember it so you know it? Imperialism can look like anything, can be quiet and intelligent and even have a pretty wife. But in the end, it is insatiable, and if it needs to, it will take your life. So he wrote that, and then I wanted to write something not in response to that, but not a response in the sense of trying to refute it, but hopefully trying to, I don't know what the word is, accentuate it. or emphasize it or underline it or just basically to say amen. It would be this way, so it would be this way. You want it to be one way, that they would get a Negro. Look, a Negro, we got a Negro. There's a drone that looks like what we want. A pretty wife, a prayer book for my passport, blew up leaving where we stay and all we got. We can have some jobs. Can we come to dinner? We want some money. We settled for a Negro. We settled in a house right by the fort. We're settlers. Call us Nathan, call me Ethan. Yes, sir, we can. Canting, severe from lounging, luxurious meetings in bloody mosses and sandy ridge, in Fort Deposit for the other way and how we sound. But it's the other way is how we sound. Our musical breakfast is free. The bottoms walk and talk like Ronnie Boykins. Our technique is feline and austere. No revenant box, just roebuck nail and wire or black hammer. Hear the new composers crying. We make our thing more social than they thought.
Jason, I was wondering if you could, I wanted for you to talk some about your music. And I was reading about your first trip to Asia and the impact that had on you and some of the music that you wrote coming out of that.
You know, I think people, or Asian American musicians, kind of struggle with the meaning of ethnicity and our appearance and our identity, and like how that can be, you know, have so many meanings and how to express that. And I think the first time I went to Korea with Sin Cha Hong, and I was in an entourage of about 20 people, and no one spoke English more than 10 words. So it was like 2 weeks and not knowing what anybody was saying, right? But I remember looking out at the street, and all I saw was black hair and eyes like me, and even though I'm Chinese and they're Koreans, the way people greeted each other and said hello. And then I saw Asian people in power, bank presidents, wealthy people. And then I just realized that, you know, my parents' immigrant experience was always so insecure, you know, living in isolation. When my father lived in Waukegan, he went through the phone book of the whole county looking for Chinese names. And then he would call them and then try to organize a meeting at a party or something like that. So outside of the city, there were very few. We were one of two families in a city of about, I think, 80,000, something like that. So, you know, the music, or like I was talking about Baraka's voice, or Oliver's playing, or Williams playing, you know, it opened a pathway to me to connect to my vibration, and you know, when I went to Korea too, and later to China in '96 at the Beijing Jazz Festival, it realized I was from a place, you know, and my parents' history coming out of the war, it just kind of vivified and made visceral, like that we are all from a place. And so the music then has become my place. It's, you know, where I can find things that are true to me, and true to my history and to my voice, to become fully resonant. And that's what I think the community organizing was about, was that type of empowerment, just through community, people sharing stories and trying to find their voice, and that striving, you know, of always trying to get something that's always kind of somewhat unreachable. But I know one time when I was with Butch Morris in Berlin, and I was watching the other band set up, and I was just sitting cross-legged, drinking a beer, and this German guy came up to me and said, "You're meditating, aren't you?" And I thought, like, yeah, you could say I am, yeah, you know. So, you know, there's the appearance of ethnicity and the expectations of ethnicity. And then what's complicated then as a performer on stage is the performance of ethnicity, of what people expect from me, of what I should sound like. And so, you know, like if I played at a festival, the review would organize me with all the Asian musicians, even though I had nothing to do with them. I had more to do with some of the others, but see, the world is organized visually, by race. And, sometimes I've used traditional instruments in my group, but to me, I like mixing the sounds. I mean, when I use those instruments, I have to say there's a biographical resonance because I imagine it to be so. I didn't grow up with those sounds, but when I hear those sounds mixed, it's like the overtones of my parents' voice, has all of that in there. So like if the band plays any note, I don't write anything, let's just play one note. Oh yeah, that's the sound of my life, So I try to do that with the violin too, because it doesn't have to be a traditional instrument. But it's maybe harder to hear because of the expectations and the performance of ethnicity. And I think any person of color performing at a festival deals with that. It's a different dynamic for every ethnicity. There's different history. There's a different forces at play. There's a different fascination. There's a different novelty. But all of that doesn't matter to us because we're trying to play what's true to ourselves.
And it was interesting, you just mentioned the fact that the Black Artist Group had their own space. And William, I was wondering if you could talk about, I think, some of the challenges New York artists have. Rents are soaring in this city. There seems to be fewer and fewer, probably well-paying gigs in this city. What can artists do? What advice do you have for young musicians who are coming into this industry?
Well, one of the first things is they have to really have a spark. We see a lot of musicians, they're going to music school now, and it's not necessarily implementing a spark in them. And it's kind of, sometimes it puts out the fire. It puts out their originality. So first of all, they've got to try to keep their spark, because you can't, if you can't do anything if you don't have your flame going, if you don't have your mojo, if you don't have your motor running. And so they have to keep their mojo working. They've got to keep their mind open and think about it. Their responsibility as a human being and an artist is to constantly probe, constantly look for rays of light and take that light and then reproduce it through their work. I mean, that's their responsibility. I mean, that, and they really have to know that what they do is super duper important. Okay, so once you have that, then you can go on the field and you can find creative ways of getting the music out. You can look and at your neighborhood and say, okay, there's no cultural center here. We need a cultural center in every, if you have so many blocks of human beings, just like in the summertime when it gets hot, there has to be a swimming pool or a park or something green. And then some neighborhoods don't have that. So if you live in a neighborhood that doesn't have that, you have to say, okay, we need a cultural center. How do we start it? Even though, we've had, unfortunately, 8 years of Giuliani and 12 years of Bloomberg, which is like worse than a death trap. I mean, it's wow. It's like they buried you and then put 20 more concrete on top. How do you get out of that? But you can get out of it. You just have to be creative and just have to find ways of doing it. First of all, you don't have to stay in New York City necessarily. You can move other places and just do concerts in New York City. But you really have to think and find ways of being creative and getting what you want out there. But you can't be stagnant. You have to keep the fire going. Okay, you have to realize that you're not free. That this is not a democracy. There's certain political things that you have to know that's happening. and you can't look the other way about them. You have to, and then there's certain political things, certain spiritual things, certain things about being a human being that you can't just be blasé about. You have to work on them, and you have to develop these things, okay? And then it'll happen. You begin to. It's just like finding your sound, finding your music. You have to constantly work on it. I mean, but you have to have the fire. You got to have some get up and go. You can't just expect somebody to knock on your door and say, okay, well, we've got a gig at the Stone, so now we've made it. I mean, or even if you say, well, there's some people, they want to gig on the Vision Festival, and they think, wow, I played at the Vision Festival. Now, the sun's going to, it doesn't, it's, no, you got to continually work on your work and do, because there's no one thing that's going to, snap things into place. Things are out of whack, and they can't just snap back into place like that. So you have to constantly work on your work, constantly do and probe and just find ways of getting the music out there, because if not, it's as Julie on the Mod Squad, he said, it's a bad scene, Link,
Well, when you say things are out of whack, what is the musician's role?
Well, the musician's role is to play music, is to play strong music. And when people listen to the music, people start to move, and they start to groove, and they start to dance, and they start to say, wow, I'm going to go in my icebox and get rid of processed food and get some good food. As I heard this music, and that's what the music was telling me. And then the music was telling me that I need to go read this book, The People's History of America by Howard Zinn, or I need to read Amiri Baraka, or I need to listen to Oliver Lake, and I need to listen to Albert Eiler as well. Okay, I need to listen to everything that's going to help me see the light. I got to take the blinders off, because people got blinders on, and then they have blinders on top of the blinders. So they got, some people have blinders on top of the blinders on top of the blinders. They have 3 sets of blinders, so they got to take those blinders off.
Well, speaking about blinders, Fred, can you talk more about, what artists can do to help remove the blinders that so many people do have?
I don't have that much. I agree with everything that Williams just said. Maybe I could say it in a slightly different way. I don't know. Sometimes I've listened to music and I felt like I've been given some kind of a glimpse, So it's on the one hand, I feel like I've been given a glimpse of like what and who we really are. And then at the very same time, giving a glimpse of what and who we can be. And the music can do both of those things simultaneously. It messes with time. C.L.R. James once had a collection of essays called "The Future and the Present," and the music can give you that sense of seeing or feeling, and also at the same time living the future and the present. And art can do that. Art gives you a sense of what the alternative is. And I know there's a lot of people, I think the way in terms of the blinders, I think people are very often blind to how bad and how problematic and how out of whack everything is. But I think there's another kind of blindness which is just as bad, which is people are blind to the alternative. They can't see another way. They can't imagine another way. And I feel like, the music and art can deal with both of those kinds of blindness. And that's why it's really, really important. It's not, I feel like it's the most important thing in the world. And it also makes you think. It makes you think thoughts that that seem too big for anybody to think. and yet you find yourself doing it. Like I've been listening to y'all talk about self-determination, and I feel like I know some about the history of that term and coming out of anti-colonial struggles, and I'm totally committed to it, and feel absolutely clear on the sense of the importance of it. And then I think of the liner notes that Baraka wrote to the benefit concert they did for the Black Arts Repertory School in '65. And at the end of those liner notes, he says, "The new black music is this: find the self and then kill it." So all this last 35 minutes, I've been thinking, okay, not that these two things are contradictory, but what I want to do is understand what the relationship is between self-determination on the one hand and find the self and then kill it on the other. But it's Baraka's art as a writer that makes me know that our brains are big enough to actually be able to deal with what seems like a contradiction in those things. And the music is constantly showing and sounding the relation between those things. And it just becomes a matter of trying to understand it, trying to think about it and try to enact it, try to live it. So.
Now, Jason, if you could comment on, I think the challenges of, obviously this music is incredibly important, but what are the challenges in bringing it to a broader population?
Well, I think has to be a recognition there's a culture shift. There's probably a greater aesthetic difference between myself and a 25-year-old than, say, myself and Baraka, as far as our mindset and thinking. And some of that, I think, for the music is because as it made inroads into the university system, it followed the European conservatory model, the method books and the tests and getting the grades. And it had to be tangible results, like if you could memorize this solo, you get an A, or do that, and you were graded by tangible results. And so much of the magic of music is intangible, is not on paper, it's not written, it's a living sound. And the other thing you recognize is there's a generation now that is learning through emulation, because emulation is a great tool, though inspiration is better. But before, you might hear a great player come to your town twice a year, and you'd go to that concert and go, wow, that sounded great. How do I play like that, right? But now, the access to YouTube videos, you can watch great performers 24/7 and dive into that. So across the arts, classical and jazz, that emulation of language has become extraordinary. Even in the classical world, if you see a little 5-year-old, 8-year-old violinist, they say, oh, those little child prodigies, they don't understand the real soul of the music. But boy, now you listen to them and you're thinking like, well, they sure the hell, imitate it pretty good, So I kind of say that so you have to kind of, the struggle too is to recognize the dynamics you're in. And then, and that's that keeps your focus and your fortitude. Because I think in any time period, there's always a clash of generational values in the music, whether it was free jazz with the hard boppers and all the proliferation of ideas that are going on right now more than ever. I mean, it's those gradations between jazz and classical and world and all that. It just there's shades of it. There's sometimes I'll listen to music and I don't like it so much, because it's 90% written and 10% improvised. And I thought, but then I stopped myself because I thought, well, that's okay, because it's a different music. So I'm careful about imposing my value system on others. But I think too, you have to realize that, getting back to the culture shift, and with those powerful tools of emulation, is that musicians can master the menu with virtuosity. They master the menu, but then they've lost sight of the food. And so it's sort of a strange thing. So I think, anyway, the best thing that a musician can do, of course, is to create and be without compromise, I think someone was talking to me about Baraka because I didn't know him really at all, you know. But they said, well, you know, he bit the hand that fed him too often. And then I thought, of course he did, you know, because he had to be who he was. That gave the ring of truth to his words, that he was unconcerned with nothing other than the truth. And I think, you know, for our sound as players, you know, that is a connection that you go for, you know. It's a different creative process. So in this time period where there's so many different aesthetics going on and competing for space in people's brains and on the radio waves and all that, I think we just have to understand our context of all the forces that are affecting people's perceptions, and then through our music, through panels, the festival, through our interviews, whatever, you know, we're able to bring some light to the situation, really advocate, I guess, for this way of playing and creating.
See, we have to realize that. So it's a fight against the forces that, you know, will give Henry Kissinger tons and tons of money to speak. But if you try to get a gig up at Harvard or Yale, I mean, we used to play at Harvard in the early days in Yale, but now it's hard to get a gig there. You know, it's hard because it's always just like the student little organizations try to bring you. But we should never have to go to Europe for a gig with as much resources and universities that we have here in America. So, so to answer the question, yes, we do need to reach, and we want to play. Every musician wants to play for as many people as possible. You know, I mean, it doesn't mean that you're not going to play if there's 3 people in the audience, but of course you want to expand the horizons. You know, if you have the cure for cancer, you want everybody to have it. Okay, and part of the cure for health and well-being of human beings is art. So we want to expose it to as many different people as possible.
The university as an institution has changed over the last 40 years, you know. And what universities are for now is a fundamentally different thing than what they were purportedly for, you know, 40 years ago. You know, the university is there to train, it provides the blinders that you're talking about. That's what universities are for. I mean, that's their function. Now, there's a few people, you know, within the university who are trying to fight against that and to swim against that. And you got to understand it. It's a combination of, on the one hand, the university is there to put blinders on people, and at the same time, the university is also there to make money for people. And the old notion that the university had was somehow detached from business or detached from profit, that's no longer, that I don't think it ever was, but now there's no even illusion of it. So, it's just a long-winded preface to the point. It's like my problem is not the students. I mean, I think students are open. The students, at least at the place where I teach now, they're open. They want to hear music. They're interested in things that they haven't heard before. They're interested in things that they haven't seen before. So, you know, but my students also, I got an email from a student last night apologizing because her parents, who are Mexican immigrants, both lost their jobs, and she's had to have 2 part-time jobs this semester in addition to going to in addition to going to school full-time. And so she's apologizing to me because she just couldn't be as active a participant in class as she had been the previous semester. So, you know, I mean, the life that students are living now, the tremendous amounts of debt you have to go into to go to school, even to like a state school, all of these things are a tremendous burden and make it that much more difficult to try to forge an education for yourself, which would be about taking blinders off and seeing things rather than becoming blind. But with all that said, I feel like my students are trying, and I think a lot of my colleagues are trying too. But the conditions in which we're operating under are the same conditions, in many ways, the same conditions that y'all are operating under too. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't a whole bunch of resources and a tremendous amount of money floating around in universities that could be used to pay for you to come give a gig rather than Henry Kissinger. But then the question is like, who has access to that money and who makes those decisions? But I feel like, I'm teaching a class next fall called Music and Literature, and we'll be listening to a lot of music, this music. And I can't teach any class that I ever teach without the music. It's not possible for me to do. And in my experience, the students are not only open to it, but they they talk explicitly about the music as illuminating the literature. The music makes things which otherwise would be difficult for them. It makes those things make sense, And when I say that the music makes things that otherwise would be difficult, I mean that what people will call difficult music makes those difficult things more clear, So sometimes I think, I'm sorry going so long, but there's a general sense, that the university has all this stuff and the university could help. The university needs help. The interesting things that happened in the university over the last 40 years happened because people outside the university imposed those things on the university. And it's the same position now. It's the same situation. University needs help. The university doesn't have a whole lot of help to give, but the university does need help. It needs to be infused with some energy from outside of itself so that it could try to re-grasp some of the liberatory functions that it used to have. And even those liberatory functions were powerful and they were really important, but they weren't the actions of a majority. You see what I mean? It's like the black radical tradition that Robinson talks about, it's a minor strain even within Afro-American intellectual tradition. It's just that it's the most powerful part of the tradition. It's like the most powerful part of the tradition is done by a few people, And we look, sometimes I'm sorry to keep, people are like, well, why is popular music so whack now, so apolitical now? But I think back, I was listening to black radio in the early 70s, and it was a lot of silly stuff on the radio. It wasn't like every song was a Curtis Mayfield song. But what we remember now, what had the most powerful impact, what had the most lasting impact is the Curtis Mayfield song.